So what happens when you start to have multiplication? Because then you've got multiple churches. How do they relate to one another? Well, typically this happens in networks. So you have multiple house churches, and then together they will form a church in the town, for example. And then maybe you'll have, as the movement grows, you'll have multiple towns, and those will maybe meet at the county level. The leadership of those will meet. And then as it continues to grow, you'll have representatives from the county level go up to the state level, and then up to the national or country level. And it can, in some cases, even go to continent level. At each level, you have representatives from the lower level at that level leadership. And the applications are then corporate. What do the churches in our community need to do? What's God calling us to do? Who do we need to share that with? And then at the county level, and the state level, and the national level. And there's always a question about what about the size at each of these levels. A good rule of thumb is you want the number of representatives at each level to be roughly equivalent to what you would want in an individual house church. And so as a general rule of thumb, I like to have 4 to 12 people in those, up to 15. But once you start getting over 15, the level of participation, the level of accountability, and so on decreases rapidly. So you know it's time to add a new level whenever you get, up to about 15. Now, they may not exactly correspond to these geographic regions. This is just an example to give you a feel for what it looks like. This type of organization, we see it in Scripture. We see it in the Old Testament. Jethro advised Moses to divide leadership. So he had people who ruled over 10 families, and then over 50 families, and then over 100 families, and then over 1,000 families. And then he had the 70 elders, and then there was Moses. And this was a pattern that we see in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we see the house churches, but then we see Paul referring to the church at Jerusalem or the church at Ephesus and so on, these city or regional churches. Then up to regions like, the Galatian churches. But then when there was a problem or there was a question, like, what about meat sacrificed to idols and so on? Ultimately, it worked its way up to the Jerusalem church, where the apostles exercised leadership over the entire movement. And so the decisions, the questions rather, would work their way up the chain in a sense, and the decisions would work their way down the chain. And so this kind of approach, we see it did happen in Scripture. So it's not, just something that we're making up. A lot of times there are questions about the role of officers in the churches, specifically elders and deacons or pastors, which is used interchangeably sometimes in the New Testament with elders. So the situation is that you'll have multiple house churches that form one city or regional church. So for example, the 7 deacons in the Jerusalem church serviced hundreds of house churches, but there were only 7 of them. There's no expectation that every house church had a deacon in it. Similarly, you have the Ephesian elders serving hundreds of house churches in Ephesus. There's no expectation that every house church in Ephesus had an elder in it. these people serve the entire network of churches. So the elders and deacons those people serve at more the city or regional level. Similarly, we typically see the expression of the leadership gifts, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers serving at that second level or higher. Their primary focus is an equipping ministry, and they serve broadly. They serve the network broadly. And so at the grassroots level, the house church, which is what we are focused on, the emphasis there is on what every disciple needs to be equipped in, what every disciple needs to be accountable for. And so there's not as much emphasis on the differences or the special gifts that need to function together at this next higher level in order for the church to accomplish everything that it's intended to. At the grassroots level, we're focused on the commonalities, not on the differences, not on the distinctives. And so this is how the networks function, and accountability takes place at each level in much the same fashion that it does in the local church, except that it's corporate accountability. But it's what we might refer to as a fractal. A fractal is something where the pattern at the micro level is the same as the pattern at the macro level. So we still have accountability expressed in 3/3 structure whenever we meet, looking back, looking up, looking forward, and so on, so that the patterns are familiar. So as people move up in leadership, they're not having to learn entire new patterns. Everything is familiar and focused on the same principles.